Hi everybody, I'm Professor Peter Jonason, your stylish scientist, and I am embarrassed to say that I missed an important engagement with some Brazilian researchers, I think last week, because for me, if it's not in my calendar, as in my electronic calendar, I just don't remember it. It just goes out of my brain. I'm so reliant on that technology, and so call this the absent-minded professor effect. But I don't want to leave these people in a lurch, so I thought I might make a video that not only they could benefit, but you can benefit from, because what I was asked to do was give some, let's say, guidance about how to publish, in particular in the flagship journal of the International Society of the Study of Individual Differences called Personality and Individual Differences. And the reason being is that I was, for basically a decade, an editor-in-chief at that journal, but I'm also the most published author in the history of that journal, including the person who created it, Hans Eysenck. So I have some bona fides about this. Now, on top of that, I publish other places as well. But the lessons that I learned through publishing in paid has really led me to develop a kind of systematic approach. You might even call it a Machiavellian approach. Indeed, that's what my title was going to be. The title of my talk was going to be, was about being Machiavellian in your publishing. The idea being not being dishonest, but by being pragmatic, by being strategic, right? So as a matter of strategy, you might work out what kinds of papers journals publish and try to submit papers that resemble that. This applies to even writing style as well. And so I'm going to try to keep this brief, but this is something that I've spent basically 20 years trying to work out through trial and error. And usually what happens is you have a supervisor who is of sufficient research bona fides that he or she can teach you the code, the combination, to get into different journals. And this is why, for example, if you don't, in America, if you're not publishing in our like journals like Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, right, journals at the top of the game, it's hard to get a professorship at universities that are, say, R1, like top-tier universities, because I can't transfer. If I'm not publishing in that journal, which I'm not, I can't transfer the code, let alone the club, to help my student become a member of that club. It's like a publishing cabal, a publishing club, where it's this like tiny little close-knit circle where these are the people who've worked out the combination. And then they just keep publishing it. They teach their students how to do it. It becomes like this club. And the rest of us are excluded from it. But that's not the only journal in the world, right? And so there are many journals who I publish with, and the code is reasonably similar to what I'm going to give you here. Right? So if your supervisor was kind of just a signatory, or your supervisor is not really a particularly strong researcher, or if your university has a system where they're really just your mentor as opposed to you're doing their research. This is one of the things that I really push with all of my students, is that they often come to me and they go to many of their professors and they'll say, I want to do this. Okay, that's what you want to do, but if you're going to be my student, you need to do my research or adjacent to my research, because then I can really help you create publications, create a persona, all these things that you need to build to be a successful publishing academic. For those people who don't submit a lot, or don't have a professor who's good at this, who does this a lot, then you're going to develop superstitions about what you think are the things that matter. And this problem is even compounded when these very same people then take over at journals and become editors and associate editors and editors-in-chief, because they really don't know how to publish articles that well themselves. They've just had some kind of random success. And what they've done is they've just tried random things, and because they've had success, they develop a theory that says, oh, that's the kind of papers that they want. Well, that's probably not the case. Right? So I'm going to give you here a series of don'ts to start with. We're going to start with don'ts, and then hopefully those don'ts will logically flow into a series of do's. In addition, I don't want to just be negative. I find that a lot of people struggle with when you give them the negative advice. When you just tell them, don't let your paragraphs be less than 3 sentences. It doesn't seem to click, I think, as well as the minimum for all paragraphs, I'm telling you this is true, in English is always 3 sentences. 3 sentences is the minimum for every single paragraph, every time, no matter what you're writing in formal prose. Every time, no exceptions, 3. Okay? That's proper English rules. Now, does it mean that papers are not submitted and published without that? Of course, because a lot of people don't actually know these rules about grammar and style from people like Strunk and White. Indeed, I used to teach a class at my former university here in Poland at UKSW about writing your research, about publishing your research. This is one of those rules I taught people. So let's do the don'ts now, okay? So, don't write about authors. The sentences shouldn't start with, Jonasson et al. Found blah, 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 okay? That is for journalists. What matters in science is the science, not the people. Even if you're criticizing, saying Jonasson's an idiot, you shouldn't do that, right? You should draw attention to the problems in the papers, in the science. Authors aren't important. It doesn't matter. There's no necessary reason that I will have published a paper. Names are not important for us. This is for historians and for journalists. Another one, avoid anthropomorphism. Don't engage in anthropomorphism in your writing. As in, don't say things like, the study suggests. Studies don't suggest anything. Only people can suggest things. Don't imbue agency into things that don't have agency, okay? Studies don't have agency. Dogs like Pedro, who's over there, do have agency. And so you should therefore simultaneously also use and avoid using passive voice. Don't use passive voice. Now, sometimes you have to, I understand. But because most of our papers are written in a team, you really could say, we found, instead of saying, it appears that there is a correlation, or so-and-so suggested a correlation between, just say it. X is correlated with Y, right? No passive voice. Or at least minimize it, okay? When reviewing research that's already out there, don't write mini abstracts. This is what students do. They take paper after paper, and they fail to integrate all those papers into a larger synthetic framework to allow them to derive predictions and to highlight the limitations of prior work to justify their very study, right? So you shouldn't have basically one paragraph that describes one study, one paragraph that describes another study. No, you should have multiple citations to the same point, for example, in parentheses. And indeed, don't oversight. You do not need to show us that you have read every single paper that has ever been written. This is what students think. They're overcompensating. Your goal as an author for academic publications is when you make an empirical claim, you simply back it up with a reference. That's all. You don't need even 2. 2 is enough in my view. But if you have a string, you're overdoing it. Don't repeat yourself. There's a kind of circularity in a lot of writing and a lot of academics, partly because of the way that they're encouraged to write as students. But when you're trying to publish in academic articles, you're not a student anymore. Even if you are a student, you're not playing in the student game. Write in a linear fashion. Don't repeat yourself, right? Go from the general to the specific as you move along, all right? Next, I would advise don't leave your hypotheses naked. By that I mean where you put them at the end of a paragraph, or you put them in a single section. This, again, is part of the formatting that is often adopted for student theses, but is not really all that useful for writing articles. Your hypotheses should flow logically from the prose that you use to back them up, and just say it. Just say, we hypothesized, or X should be correlated with Y, or whatever it is, right? Like that. Next. Don't assume that the way you wrote as a student, which I kind of alluded to already, is how you write for an academic. These are different games. It's the same. The skills that got you here are not the skills that are going to help you to be successful here, right? So you have skills that get you to graduate, but then you need to develop new skills to play in a different game, because now you leave the small pond of your local university, And now you have to fight in the big bad world. And in the big bad world, things are harder and different. Next, don't try to do too much in a single paper. Try to consider what's the best message, right? Hone it down to something straightforward and reasonably simple. Not too simple, but reasonably simple. Don't do too much in a single paper, right? Make very few points, okay, in terms of data analysis, for example. Don't let your ego get in the way. Now, of course, you say, oh, professor, but I know you. Your ego is tremendous. Yes, okay, fine. That's true. But I can tell you stories, as I tell my students when I lecture with them, about how my ego has gotten in the way of some of my publications. So don't be so wed to what you think the paper says that you miss the opportunity to edit it and get it published. Right? Accept the idea that your paper might not be as great as you think it is. Don't use 10 words when 5 words will do. Don't use complicated words. Don't use polysyllabic words when you can use a monosyllabic word. Just as a stupid example, as I tell my students, and that's present on my website about writing, which you can go to at www.peterjonason.com, of course, is don't utilize big words. Use simple words. Now, we're overcompensating as students, and we're overcompensating because we want what we do to seem important. But now we're just being unnecessarily showy-offy, and this is vulnerable narcissism, not grandiose narcissism. Don't rely on self-report Likert methods only, right? You might have to use them a little bit, like in terms of personality assessment, but don't rely on them only. If you do that, you will struggle to publish in better journals. Does that mean that all papers published, for example, in these journals like Journal of Personality and Personality and Individual Differences and Archives of Sexual Behavior are themselves inherently therefore all not self-report? No, of course. Some of them are self-report. Some slip through the cracks. Some say things that are wow, like we hadn't thought of that, or has an amazing data set, or etc. But as a rule, try to not be overly reliant on a bunch of questionnaires, or as my Russian friends say, questionnaires. Don't simply replicate some effect in the country. Let's say, oh, well, we wanted to replicate what you found, Professor Jonason, in Japan. Well, the default assumption is it should be present. What's more compelling would be to actually test, right? Would be to actually test differences between nations in the magnitudes of correlations, for example, right? But to just replicate the effect, you get published, don't get me wrong, but you won't get published in amazing journals because the null hypothesis is that there isn't a difference. So just finding it is like, yeah, that's what we would have expected. People are people. Avoid, this is a very common mistake, avoid hiding your lack of English skills, avoid hiding your lack of thought with overly complicated statistics, right? So what you see from a lot of non-English speaking countries, and I see this from China to Brazil to wherever we can talk about, in all the journals that I have worked for, there is this often tendency in these groups to structural equation models and confirmatory factor analysis and all kinds of complex stats which feel like an overcompensation for the fact that your paper is, it's just self-report, or it's rather straightforward and modest, or you failed to simply take those pieces out that were required in a student thesis, because often the requirements of student theses are different than what we want in a paper. In a paper, we just want theory testing. Just get to it. A little one, and there's some data to back this up, that papers that put the country's name in the title tend to be cited less. And so this is not exactly about publishing, but it's sort of that. Like, you don't want to make such a big deal, unless you really, really have to, about the fact that this is in a Polish sample, in a Malaysian sample, or whatever it is, right? Your findings are supposed to be about the world, about people, right? The fact that you have this sample, well, if you think that's a problem, then you should do something about that. But otherwise, this study was about the relationship between the dark triad and responses to infidelity or something like that. Right? It doesn't matter that they were Polish people or Italian people, in principle. Don't jump ahead to complex statistics like regression, which people use not only wrongly, but way too much. Don't just jump ahead to complicated statistics when you haven't done the basic ones. And indeed, don't just dump everything into a regression and say, I included sex and age as controls. These aren't controls, okay? First of all, you should establish initial relationships first, and then if they're really important, they should be justified in the introduction and not treated as controls, but treated as moderators, treated as robustness tests, okay? So now that I've given you what is about, I think, 15 don'ts, let's go to some more positive things for the next 5 minutes on the do's. Do write in a streamlined, direct, and linear fashion. Do take the same idea and test it 2 or 3 times simply by varying the methods. For example, you might do the same thing where one study 1, is Likert style, right, is normative data, but study 2 could be a forced choice approach, right? So jealousy as an example, right? So you might ask people to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, how bothersome is this jealousy-inducing scenario, but in the next study, you could ask people to choose which of these 2 jealousy-inducing scenarios bothers you more. That's 2 studies right there. Now you have replication. This helps you, this ups your game a little bit, right? This makes the paper more appealing because it's not just a one-off effect. You show methodological robustness to your effect, right? Try to model the presentation of your results, of your tables, of your figures, simultaneously with submissions and publications that you see in that journal. Like go to that journal and look at the most recent publications, yeah, and model as best you can, right? And so you should have already learned from your supervisors, and you were modeling theirs, but if they weren't particularly good researchers, getting a lot of things published, then you can't really do that. And they can't transfer that knowledge because they don't really have it. So what you have to do then is do the work. If you have poor supervision, you have to do the work after the time, or you have to find a mentor, right? So I have many people that I work with now who already have their PhDs, but I'm mentoring them in this game, right? This how do you play this Machiavellian game of publishing, figuring out the equation for the journals, and also figuring out the equation for the reviewers. You need to develop a sense of reviewer or editor empathy or emotional intelligence as you learn how to predict the kinds of things that they're likely to say that in reviews of your papers so that you can do them in advance to basically shut them up and streamline the process. So think out, okay, what would somebody say? What would they ask me? Right? I mean, then imagine a particular reviewer. So what would Professor Jonason say with this paper? Well, we didn't look at sex differences, and we didn't look at moderation by sex. Okay, we should do that. Yeah, but politically, I don't like studying sex differences. Yeah, okay, fine, but this is not a place for politics. This is a place for science. And so it matters that you fully understand and explore the data that you have. Right? So this is about the point about jumping to complicated statistics. You need to start with basic tests to move on to more complex tests. Consider cross-cultural mechanisms. So if you want to replicate an effect in your local sample, great. But collect data in another place, which is great, but then consider, well, what might be the mechanisms that account for these effects? Now, mechanisms are always worth exploring. But in the case of cross-cultural and cross-national data, super worth exploring, right? So you could collect 2 data sets, like we just recently collected data from Australia and Poland, and the question would be, yeah, okay, if there are differences, just like if there are differences between men and women, what are the reasons for those differences? What are the mechanisms that drive those differences? Don't be afraid to consider brief reports. Remember, if your ego is tied up in the paper, you'll want it to be longer. But look yourself in the mirror and say, is this really such a great paper? Is it really so important? Brief reports can be let's call it a sneaky way of getting a publication. And a lot of journals don't even call them brief reports. Okay? Find giants in the field, okay? Whoever you want, right? And link up with them, and work with them, and help and try to learn through their advice, as painful as it might be, because you think, oh, I have my PhD, therefore I'm ready. Unfortunately, probably not. right? Oftentimes nowadays people come up with their PhDs and they're not ready, which is why we have a lot of postdocs going on. So find someone who is a star in your field and maybe see if you can help them and work with them. Okay? Stay up to date on issues related to sample size and power analysis, in particular on subsamples, when you break up your samples into smaller groups. The standards for sample sizes have been changing within my lifetime. I'm sure within my full lifetime, but within my academic lifetime, they've changed quite a bit. You're going to hate this one, but review for the journals that you want to publish in. It'll give you a sense, albeit maybe indirectly, of the kinds of things that people are submitting to this journal. And if you find out that that particular paper was accepted, it might further serve as a modeling system to say, okay, what did they do here? What can I take from them to allow me to say, okay, these are the kinds of things that that might matter, right? That might help me publish. Will they? Not necessarily, because you have to have the eye. But after doing this lots and lots of times, you will develop that eye. Okay? Try to include tasks or behaviors. If you have to rely on self-report data, do what I like to call the Del Paul House approach, which is you pair it with something real. Create a task, a behavioral task, like people having to make choices between things, like moral dilemmas or something like we have done in the past. Engage them in some sort of task where they have to do something, and then you use that as the dependent variable. This will up your ability to publish in better journals. I encourage people to have at least 3 different specialties when they're moving towards the place of trying to go up for tenure. The first 2 could be quite scientific, quite dry, all that. But one other one should probably be sexy. It should be clickbaity. Because let's be honest, these things matter now. And as much as you want to live in your ivory tower and look down at people who want to be popular, probably because you were a loser in high school, as I was too, don't be afraid of popularity. Clickbaity research gets you lots of benefits in the world. I'm not saying all your research should be clickbaity, but some of it should be clickbaity. You should test the assumptions in your models, like, say, measurement invariance. But when you don't meet those, don't stop moving. Okay, there's things don't always go as planned. And what's often taught to students, which is what it carries over to people's young academic careers, is this sense of idealism, this sense of perfectionism. No, life's dirty, life's messy. You're not necessarily going to find some of these things met. The question is, do they even matter, right? I mean, let's say you violate the Levine's test of homogeneity, and when you use a t-value that doesn't require that assumption to be met, and you draw the same conclusions, well, you're in this space of doth do protest too much, right? Be pragmatic, right? Which is a Machiavellian feature. Don't get debilitated, don't get frozen in space because you collected this amazing data and now you can't meet these relatively arbitrary and newly imposed assumptions tests. Okay? Try to consider not just the psychometric nature of the things that you're studying, right, in this kind of space within me, but consider the things that came before. Think about the causes of why I might have these traits or these motives. And think about the consequences of those things too. Make your science more robust by considering real life outcomes. People are really interested in this, especially in the workspace. But also, okay, but the development of these things. Where do these even come from? Why do people have different moral systems, for example? Okay? It's not wrong to translate scales and to validate them. It's a valuable endeavor. But it's more important that you use that translation as quickly as possible for some scientific purpose. Don't just go around translating measures for the sake of translating measures. You will struggle to publish in PAID. You will struggle to publish in Journal of Personality. You will struggle to publish in the International Journal of Psychology, all right? Because translations on their own aren't very useful and don't get much citations. What gets citations is theory testing. So use that newly translated scale to test something. Do consider the issue of marketing. How you write matters. How it looks matters. I know you say, oh, we're professors. We live in this space where aesthetics don't matter, right? We're not the stylish scientists like you, Professor Jonason. Yeah, okay, I understand, but you're cutting off your knees here. So think about the title. Sexy titles catch people's eye. There's thousands of papers that come out every day. How do you get read? How do you get cited? Now, I know there's a matter of debate about this, and there's some really amazing researchers that I won't mention that I've talked about this, and they have completely an alternative perspective on this. But my perspective is you should try to market your papers in a way that people will be like, oh, I want to read this paper. And even if they don't like what you said, they read it, they downloaded it. Indeed, I would say that journals should encourage this more, and it might actually increase their impact factor, because more people will have downloaded their articles in a theory because they've downloaded and read them. Then they might say, oh, I like this idea, I want to test that. Or I don't like this idea, and I want to show them that they're wrong. This is great for everybody. So think about the sexy marketingness of your papers. Similar to that, I know it's hard for people to do, and I'm very pedantic, as any of my students and minions would tell you without, and I wouldn't hide from it. Little details matter. Commas matter. Number of decimal points matter. Spelling matters. All of these things matter. Have an eye for detail, right? And I mean like a microscope for detail. Little bitty things matter. Understand the rules that APA has set out. Even understand why some of those rules are stupid and violate them, but be consistent, right, in that violation. Because that's okay. Consistency is great, okay? But you should be detail-oriented enough to notice when you read your paper, your student's paper, your colleague's paper, oh, there's a typo here, there's an extra space here, there's a missing whatever. Be detail-oriented. Test for robustness, like moderation, as I already alluded to. Test for moderation. You might not think it matters. Test it, and then you can say, this effect is the same when you look at data from Australia and Poland. Great. Okay? Only 3 more, I promise. And then I'll give you a quick summary of what to say. Write papers that constitute singles, like in baseball, right? Getting to the first base, while you're working on larger projects that can be triples and home runs. Because you need to generate papers to keep yourself alive and published and going toward tenure. And if you only focus on home runs, well, that's putting all your eggs in a risky basket. But if you do singles, you build up a program of research. So you don't get published in the same quality journals, but you could still get published in pretty good journals 10 times, for example. Right? And these can all serve as a larger package that you could use to describe your work in your habilitation proceedings. Next, reviewers, look, I mean, there are sometimes when reviewers are totally wrong, like they've read the wrong paper. That has happened to me at least twice. And sometimes reviewers are just also wrong about what they've said. Maybe they didn't read that detail, or they were wrong about the way they think about statistics, or wrong about what you did. The truth is, as one of my former supervisors, mentors said, reviewers are always right. It doesn't mean they're right about what you did, but it could mean that they're right as in they're confused. And so take that opportunity to make adjustments. Now, this is very different than what one of our most famous colleagues, Adrian Furman, would probably tell you, which he would say, just submit it to another journal if it gets rejected, for example. But my advice is, take those reviewers' feedback, even if the paper is rejected, at least somewhat to heart, and make some adjustments. It will incrementally improve the paper, gives respect to the people who spent their time reviewing it, and you might learn something about your presentation style and how better to go about these things. Last one. Yeah, look, remember this is supposed to be fun. If you didn't want to have a good time at work, you would have gone and worked a 9 to 5. So have fun with this. Don't get so bogged down in minutia and overthinking and worry and all these things. Like, try to have a good time. Try to have a good time in the topics you choose. Try to have a good time with your colleagues. Right? We live in a time when people struggle to have professional relationships that are enjoyable. They might have professional relationships that are productive, but enjoyment is risky. But you gotta go back to this time, because the most lucrative collaborations come from when you're just enjoying each other's company. Just as two examples, some of my most lucrative collaborations came from drinking and smoking cigars together. Norm Lee and I, John Gruda and I, right? This all originated just from, like, I saw John Gruda. I met him for the first time in Belfast, and we just drank some Guinness, and now we talk nearly every day about research, about stuff. Like, he's, you know, one of my closest friends probably. So try to have a good time. All right. Okay. So those are the 20 do's. So I've got 15 don'ts, 20 do's, and hopefully if you watch this enough repeatedly, you'll learn all of them. I know it's a lot, and this has already been 30 minutes. So let me quickly give you just simply 6 summary points. So if you want to just skip to the end in the future, here are 6 summary points. 1, be systematic. 2, be efficient. 3, be brief. 4, be theory-minded. 5, be resilient. And 6, be bold, my friends. All right? So that's all for me. If you want to know any more about any of these particular points, leave a comment, email me, anything like that. If you want to get more specific advice, ask away. Okay? Ciao, everybody.